Piali, Kwalitanetzik, Niatoka, Nicola Halika Sanchez Hood, Nimaya Pipil, and Kuskatlan. I'm so happy to be with all of you here today. What a special thing to come together to learn. Thank you so much to the Nahanni family for their beautiful welcome to their territories. Because I'm speaking to you about decolonization today, I couldn't begin without once again recognizing that not only are we on the territories of this beautiful family, but we're also on the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nations territory. And although that's become a really common thing to acknowledge in Canada, that you're on someone else's territory, what often goes unsaid is that those are unsurrendered and occupied territories. So some of us might be here today as guests, and some of us have found our way here in other ways, but ultimately we're on someone else's territory, and so I really invite you to think about what that means as we explore this idea of decolonization. And as a decolonial educator, I get to have a lot of really interesting conversations with people, often really difficult conversations. But to my surprise, one of the most difficult conversations I have, one of the most difficult questions that I ask is if people can name the territories and nation on whose lands their grandmothers were born. And for a lot of settler Canadians, this is a really difficult question to answer. And it's also one that brings up a lot of pain. And that's where I want to start this conversation today, is around this notion of colonization in relation to historical amnesia. Because although it's become a common theme in Canada that we talk about intergenerational trauma for Indigenous people, one thing that's not talked about is the intergenerational trauma that's also had to happen for settler people to be complicit in such a violent history. And in order for us to know where we want to go together, we need to know where we are, and for us to know that, we need to know where we've been. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the history of colonization in Canada, but I really want to emphasize this is a global phenomenon. There's not a single corner of the world that colonization hasn't been enacted upon. So whether you're a settler Canadian, whether you're a visitor, whether you're a newly landed immigrant, this applies to you. And if you want to learn more about your own particular history, just go home and Google colonization and your nation, and you'll see a long and violent history. But for today's purposes, we're just going to talk about colonization in Canada. And so one of the most common things that people are really aware of in terms of our colonial legacy in Canada is that of residential schools. However, what's often left out of that conversation is the fact that those residential schools were in effect for over 150 years, that the last residential school did not close until 1996, that the mortality rate in those residential schools was often around 50%, that the Canadian government intentionally used the subjects of those schools to test the impacts of starvation on human bodies, as well as the impacts of electric chairs. The creation of the RCMP was in fact to remove children from their homes in order to bring them to these schools, as well as to police Indigenous people to remain on the lands that were designated to them as reserve lands in their own home territories. And finally, this legacy resulted in the kidnapping of over 150,000 children. And that's just the children themselves that were removed. And that's not even talking about all of the generations that were implicated because of the horrible abuse that went on in these schools. So the other forms that colonization took in this country were that of biological warfare, intentional, systematic biological warfare. 90% of some of the First Nations in British Columbia were wiped out at a time when a vaccine for smallpox was available and well used among settler Canadians. This is, I think, one of the most powerful pictures that depicts the history of colonization in this country. Another strategy that was used to clear people from the land and force people into submission, into capitalism, into living on reserves, was the intentional extinction of keystone species like the buffalo in the prairies. But this happened in the north with sled dogs. It happened in the east coast with different fisheries. And so this strategy of extinction to force people into submission is part of our colonial history in Canada. So this means that if you're more than a first-generation Canadian, this is historical bystander trauma that your parents and grandparents have lived through, and that in fact also lives in you. And I really want to dispel this myth today that decolonization is the work of Indigenous people, Whether you have ancestors that were colonizers or colonized, we are all colonized people. And so this work of decolonization is really work that we need to come together to do with one another, equally accepting our roles, our locations, our privileges in ways in which we can start to move towards a future that looks like healing, that looks like justice, that looks like dismantling systems of oppression. So I'd be very happy if I could say that this historic colonization is where it ends, but unfortunately that's not the case. Today, colonization in Canada looks like the fact that we're here occupying someone else's territory. Well, there's never been treaties made or honored, at least on these territories. It looks like over 4,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country, a number that keeps on rising despite government promises of an inquiry or an intervention. It looks like common practices such as the apprehension of Indigenous babies when they're born by Child and Family Services if their families are deemed unfit by the state. It looks like over 200 First Nations who live without access to clean drinking water and other forms of infrastructure that almost every other Canadian feels entitled to. And finally, it looks like the ongoing poisoning and removal of Indigenous people from their traditional lands and territories for resource extraction processes like the tar sands and like one we're all probably very familiar with right here, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I've worked with a lot of settler people who really want to do something about this, but they don't know where to begin. And they feel paralyzed with guilt and shame about this truly ugly history that we've all found ourselves in. And so if I could just leave you with one message today, it would be this. This history is not your fault, but it absolutely is your responsibility. What happened, what has been done is not your fault, but where we find ourselves here together, whether we're Indigenous people, whether we're settler people, whether we're somewhere in between, this is work that we need to pick up. We need to have the courage to look at our past. We need to have the courage to look at where we are now, and we need to work together to figure out how we can collectively heal moving forward. I think it's really important to make the distinction between indigenization and decolonization. As Nigel mentioned, I had the incredible privilege of working on the Viceland documentary series Rise, and in that role I got to work with Indigenous communities in every continent of the world. And I want to give a shout out to all the Indigenous people on Earth, because the work of indigenization, the work of linguistic revitalization, the work of ceremony, the work of land-based practice, the work of land-based defense, Indigenous people are holding it down. And that is work for Indigenous people to do. That is not work for anyone else to pick up and start to appropriate and call their own. However, decolonization is work that belongs to all of us. Decolonization. We are never going to go back and erase the past. It has already been done. But what we can do is we can start to put spokes and wheels of oppression, of movements that create our social systems of inherent inequity. And to be totally honest, if you wanted to just be motivated to do this for selfish reasons, that would be good enough. We're looking at a state of global climate catastrophe. We're looking at mass migrations because people can no longer inhabit their homelands. And these are all ramifications of a colonial and capitalist worldview that eradicated a balance, a sense of reciprocity, a sense of spiritual connection to our homelands. And so if we continue forward without acknowledging the Indigenous people on whose lands and territories we live, we're headed for certain disaster. One of the biggest gifts I've ever been given in my life is the gift of my own prophecy, the Mayan prophecy, which speaks about this time particularly on Earth. And it teaches us that this is the time, for the first time in all of human history, that our consciousness have come to a level of evolution where we can actually see from one another's eyes. The way that it's explained is that the eyes of the serpent can see through the eyes of the eagle. And so the eyes of the north and the eyes of the south can actually see through one another's eyes and begin to work together and understand each other's worldviews. And the secondary part of that prophecy is that absolutely every person who came to be alive on Earth at this time came for a specific reason and came with specific gifts that are needed to do this work that we have laid out in front of us. And I really believe that. And that's why I really want each of you to pick up this work of decolonization as your own, because we need you. Whether we like it or not, colonization is a messy and shameful history that connects us all. Here we are all in this room together. So what do we do moving forward? When people ask me, what can I do to decolonize? I give them a caveat and I tell them, well, that's not going to be a one answer. It's not going to be a one-day fix. However, I can give you a few first steps, because if you do your work, then we can come back together and collectively do the real work that needs to be done. So if you want to go home today and start to enact your journey of decolonization, you can figure out how to answer that first question I said to you. Where do your people come from? How did you get here? Learn whose land you live on and what has been done to them in order for you to occupy their lands. Address the oppressive systems and history that enable you to occupy the territory you do now. Find out how you benefit from this history and activate one strategy wherein you can use your privilege to dismantle that. And share this knowledge, share this conversation with your barista, with your babysitter, with your Tinder date. I don't care. But I want you to have these conversations. And I promise you, when you start to have these conversations of looking at a longer now, of asking the history of people, your world will suddenly become a lot more interesting. And so will your identity. Finally, what's it all for? Why should we do this? Well, because decolonization looks like living without paralyzing guilt and shame about who you are and the social identity you've inherited. Decolonization looks like giving up social and economic power and privilege that directly disempowers, appropriates, and invisibilizes others. Decolonization looks like smashing the patriarchy. Decolonization looks like doing the work to find out who you are, where you came from, and committing to build communities that work together to collectively create a more sustainable and equitable future. And finally, decolonization looks like celebrating who we are and connecting with the unique knowledge knowledge that we each bring to this time and that we need to solve the problems that are laid out in front of us. So it's really easy to think about our future ancestors because we have such beautiful little ones in the room. Good reminder. Thank you so much for opening this space today. But I really invite you to look back and think about your grandmothers that I asked you about, and take a moment to look forward and ask yourself what you can do in your lifetime, what you can do today and in your work and with your passions and with your gifts to start to dismantle a history that none of us should be proud of, so that maybe we can offer an inheritance for our future ancestors for not only a planet that's livable, but a social system and community that's equitable and just. Tlask Kamati, thank you so much.